All right, welcome everybody. It is Thursday, November 1st, 2018. This is the Kubernetes Architecture Special Interest Group meeting that we do weekly on Thursdays. And if you want to follow along after the fact, our agenda is located at, annoying phone call. Our agenda is not located at an annoying phone call. It is located at bit.ly/sig-architecture. And you can open that now, and we're going to go through that. So the first item up on the agenda is the the PR for our charter. Let me pull that up here. And basically, this is not much more than the boilerplate that is provided by the steering committee for us and other SIGs to work with. The idea was to optimize around the norms that are established across all SIGs and not necessarily try and invent new forms of governance for our own SIG. So you'll notice that it's pretty stripped down, pretty in alignment with all the other SIG charters that have been merged. So there were a few things that have come up over time, concerns about the crew, etc. And basically, it feels like those things can and should be reviewed over time. And that the best thing to do is just to start with a charter draft so that we have some governance, because right now, as the SIG is lined out, it's pretty, I mean, our charter is pretty rudimentary. So the second half of this work is that we need to go in and define our sub-projects. There's already some language out there. We already decided last meeting what those sub-projects roughly are. So it's more somebody just needs to schlep their way through a PR and actually write it out and do that. So I can do that. I would love for somebody to pitch in and help, and that would be divine. Speaking of which, I'm going to give a quick shout out to Matt Farina, who spent at least an hour learning how to manage the KEP board and going through KEPs and checking that their status and their state were aligned in the board. Thank you so much for that. That is a really generous gift of time to the SIG. So, Brian, was there something that you wanted to mention on the charter thing?
Yeah, just I think, starting simple, merging and iterating is great. As you pointed out numerous times, we're lacking people moving our efforts forward. The efforts are around API and architectural governance and the review process, like the API review process that we've talked about for a long time. The KEP process, the conformance efforts, and the code organization, which is the most understaffed of all the things that we've been talking about for the longest. So, we're making good progress on conformance. We're starting to make some progress on KEP, and I'm hoping to rekindle the progress on the API review process and get those things moving. I think those are top priority for the SIG, is to actually move things forward and get things done. So let's focus on that. So that's about all I had to say for that.
Okay. Interestingly, too, as Matt was going through the process, he found a few API review candidate PRs out there. So, or at least KEPs that had implications as far as APIs. So that was a nice, that confirmed that there is value in going through these things and putting some scrutiny on them and seeing what needs to be reviewed by this SIG. Because, and he'll probably back me up in saying this, that it was probably 20% of the KEPs had some sort of architectural impact. So granted, we don't necessarily need to manage 80% of the KEPs that don't affect us, but it's going to be these ones that seem innocuous that have implications that we need to sort out and filter out.
Yeah, absolutely. And right now that's super manual. Hopefully moving the KEPs to a repo unto itself will create a tolerable amount of traffic so that we can monitor it more closely for API reviews. Definitely some more automation would help surface those. things. The role board was again pitched during the community meeting just now. We might want to think about if there are concrete tools that we think we can help us, and someone has bandwidth to work with someone to get those things built. We might want to consider posting a role to the role board. And it doesn't just have to be building tooling, it could be other things as well. But right now, I think we're even bottlenecked on the oversight and figuring out what to do side. But once we get that under control, there are probably other people we can recruit to help.
Another thing too was that we talked about the crew and sort of what that decision-making body looks like, because we do have sort of a generalized decision-making function. I mean, there are things that come to us that we just need to come up with some sort of consensus on. And the federated model that basically is what Dims was describing, essentially that if you've got ownership, if you're in an owner's file in any of the sub-projects that we have, then you're automatically federated into the decision-making body. So what I'd like to see us do, and we can codify this later in our charter or what we want to do, but let's not stall on it, but let's figure out what the best decision-making process is, because I'm not a fan of voting, but I'm also not a fan of one person is the decider either. It should be some sort of collaboration, and I think that process about how we come to decisions about things is something that that's something we can definitely innovate on. It can help other SIGs.
Yeah, I think we can improve on that. For the things that have come to the group, we have clear deciders in the decision process, right? Like if it's an API change, we have API approvers. It's not the SIG as a whole, it's a specific subgroup of the SIG. For other general issues like KEPs to come, I think we provide some guidance or raise issues that they take back. So it's not a decision as much as informative sort of role or function. And I think that's fine for whoever shows up, can definitely provide their wisdom or insights into the problem without a formal decision-making process. So, there may be issues that do come up where we need new processes, but I think for the most part, so far, that hasn't really come up in this forum.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that Dims's concerns are heard, because he's very passionate about it, and I understand and get where he's at on that. So I just want to respect that there's a lot of commentary that we had that I think at some point we need to reconcile and just figure out the right way to do it.
Sure.
I had a question on that topic. So it seems like in the latest revision of the charter, we've essentially pushed a lot of the work and the decision-making down into these sub-projects. And it's not clear to me how, so the sub-projects, looking at the relevant page, are defined by owners' files in various different repositories, as far as I can tell. How do people, and we're sort of complaining that people are not getting involved enough in the work of the SIG. How do people actually get involved? I mean, do any of these sub-projects meet and discuss things? Are there mailing lists? Is there any forum whereby people can contribute here, or how do they get into this process where all the work happens?
Yeah, so I guess a couple of things about that. One is the sub-projects in sigs.yaml we're in process of updating based on our previous thread, Quentin, about what the sub-project should be. So we're copying that from the previous PRs and docs into sigs.yaml kind of as we speak. In terms of where those discussions take place, I think it depends on the KEP process. It's mostly through discussions in this meeting and or SIG-PM and specific PRs and issues in the community repo. With respect to conformance testing, there are discussions regularly in this meeting, and there's also the CNCF working group, which meets monthly, and there is a mailing list for that. And there are specific issues and PRs that get labeled conformance, principally in Kubernetes. And there is a GitHub team as well. And if you want to get more involved with that, I think it's pretty easy. But I mean, if you have any questions or doubts or want to get looped in, I would suggest email to SIG Architecture. On the API review process, you can reach out to the API approvers and say, hey, I want to learn how to do more API reviews.
So I just want to rear what I heard with Quentin's question, which is SIGs are required to have public meetings. But apparently decisions are not made in SIGs, they're made in sub-projects. Where's the required meeting that I can attend that's public for a sub-project?
It's this one.
And you gave a super duper long answer.
Well, I mean, principally it's this one. So across the entire project, many SIGs have multiple sub-projects. And they don't necessarily have meetings for every single sub-project. Like if you look at SIG Network, there are services, there's ingress, there's pod networking, there's CNI, there are a bunch of different sub-efforts. A lot of the work on the project gets done in PRs and not in meetings, and that is also true for the SIG. Right, so like the conformance PRs, there are many in flight. We have dashboards. If you want to help manage the dashboards, reach out to Jace. If you want to help do some of the work on the dashboards, go to town. There are lists of tons of KEPs and conformance issues and other issues that need attention.
But let me just make it clear, and it sort of goes back to what Eric said. So this is not me asking how do I get involved. This is me pointing out that we're complaining that not enough people are involved.
Exactly, right.
And we don't clearly communicate how people should get involved, because the web page at the moment has a bunch of inaccurate sub-projects as far as I can tell, and no indication of how people can actually get involved and help here. So if the answer is they should come to this meeting, then, and that's where, tasks get allocated and people can help, that's fine, but it's not actually clear.
That is actually true, because we regularly go over Jace has created dashboards for the sub-efforts, and we go over those dashboards pretty regularly in this meeting, so you can get a sense for what the group does for that. I totally agree that we need to update the list of sub-projects to more accurately reflect the work the group is currently doing, and we're working on that. If what you're also asking for the page to say, here's how to get involved, I think that would be useful. We can probably add that to the SIG Architecture README, but if someone wanted to get involved and the first thing they did is come to this meeting, I think that would be a pretty good start.
But I think he's saying, has anyone ever come to the meeting and said, I'd like to get involved in X? And then at that meeting, we said, great, do Y. Has that never happened?
Yes, we do that all the time. In fact, there's nobody taking notes right now.
Well, that's an example where nobody volunteered to do that. But
okay, I'm going to interrupt you all because I'm.
Please, thank you.
So, so that's a main problem. Like, we are saying that we don't have people. We have to welcome people, and we have to get them to do what we would like them to do. So for each of the sub-projects, we should have a few things that we write down saying, go look at this GitHub query, go look at this dashboard, some minimum stuff like 4 or 5 lines for each of the sub-projects. If we can write them up, we can point that to people and say, that's where the work gets done. Please go involve yourself in the PRs and look at the reviews and, look at the KEPs and look at these KEPs, which are of importance to us, and look at these dashboards and see if you can make progress on the dashboards, moving things from one column to the other, right? So
yes.
At least that we need to document. Hopefully, I don't know if it's in the SIG charter, but we have to do that for each of the.
Yeah, the charter is not the best place for that. The README is probably.
That's fine. Yeah.
Would you be willing to help put that into the README?
Yes, I can do that.
Okay.
Thank you.
And I just want to call out, and Aaron, I'm sorry, I totally am jumping in front of you right now, but this is topical. The process for Matt Farina to make a huge impact on our KEP board was him saying to me in Slack, hey, Jace, I want to help. I'm like, okay, you're so going to regret it, but here we go. The next thing I did was I added him to the maintainers file for the board so that he can move cards around on the board and look at those things. Next thing he did was poke around at a few and then ask me a few questions, and I helped them figure out what was what and what the states were. It was interactive, but it happened and work got done, and it was really pretty easy. But I'm not exaggerating when I say that no one no one has approached me about actually doing the work. Not one person.
Matt's been in the community for like 3 years, if not longer. So he pretty much knew the right person to go find that Slack's the right way to do it.
Correct.
What I'm hearing is, like, if you're very capable, but you don't know where to go, unless you know how to navigate the hierarchy, there's no label. Like a sub-project, what's a sub-project? It's not a resource locator.
100%. We need to get better at that. I'm just saying that there isn't a blocker right now, except it's just not clear. So
yeah, there is a blocker in the sense that you need to get to know people, and unless you know all the people on the call right now, it's very difficult for a beginner to start and be productive, right? I mean,
although for this is not necessarily the best SIG for pure beginners.
Right, that's true. Yeah.
Aaron, you've been really patient.
I hope we're not trying to solve the problem of how to best govern sub-projects for every SIG for all sub-projects here.
No.
Just to echo what Jason Dims are saying, if you want to do the work, I think the lo-fi way of doing this, until there is a really strict formal process, is to find the person who's doing the work and ask them how you can help them out. So if you're interested enough to do the work, you're interested enough to know where or how the work is happening. If you don't know that, then sub-projects are laid out in the README files for all of the different SIGs. And yeah, okay, those owners files aren't great, but those owners files are a list of points of contact. So now you have a GitHub username that you can go bug, and maybe you're resourceful enough to go there. I think the general higher level things, like Brian is suggesting, ask the mailing list. We could make that boilerplate in any SIG's README. Hey, if you're interested in any of these sub-projects and you're not sure where to start, please send an email to blah. I think Dim's thing of enumerating just a couple sentence description of what a sub-project is and why it is there is also a great idea. And guess what? Our automation supports all of this level of stuff. You can add description fields for all the sub-project, and that'll get written out to the README. Then if you want to take it a step further and set up a separate mailing list for that sub-project and have a separate meeting at a separate time and a different agenda and all that stuff, we can do all of that too. But I feel like we can bootstrap ourselves by, if you're interested in the work, here's the person to contact. I'm not sure that we need a really super well-constructed, polished, gilded funnel for all of our sub-projects. Just a definition of what they are and who's working on them, and please go talk to them to help out. Now, if that's too hostile for onboarding people, or if that's not addressing your concerns, Quentin, I do want to understand where we're lacking in that right now, because I feel like what Jason and Dims were proposing is a step in the right direction.
Sure. I mean, I think what I'm proposing is that it be very clear where work and decisions are actually happening. And if they're happening on issue lists or PRs with particular labels, let's just state that this is where this sub-project does its work and this is where the decisions get made. And if you want to get involved in helping with that work or being involved in those decisions, here's where you go. And if it's this meeting, that's fine. But it doesn't seem like a lot of that work happens in this meeting, which is fine. If it's a different meeting, then let's tell people where that is and when it happens. And if it's on a mailing list, there are no links to any mailing lists in here. There are no links to any issue lists. There's no list of things that need to be done that people can go and have a look at and say, oh, I can do that. Let me contribute. Here's how I do it. And I think,
where here
is difficult.
When you said there's nothing here, what do you mean, where is here? You mean the charter specifically, or the README, or what? Or both?
The charter or the README or the minutes. And we cancel this meeting fairly regularly if there are no agenda items, which is fine. But we're complaining that people are not contributing. Where do they go to find out what needs to be done and do it?
So, the meeting notes do have lists to the mailing list and to the tracking boards.
Yeah, and I also want to point out that if you look at the API review process, it is laboriously detailed in terms of how to get involved and what the promotion ladder is and who you contact. And if somebody, again, any of these sub projects that people are passionate about, especially the code organization stuff, please write one of these documents that I did and get it reviewed and merged, because that would be the most helpful thing, is to have this kind of level of deep documentation that explains things, and anybody can read this document and understand how to get involved. It has names, it has places, it has everything that you need to know. It's like, this is one of our sub-projects. We only have a few more. So somebody please step up and document these things. And that would be a great step in the right direction as well. So
yeah, can we consider who our audience is for this? Like, people who have never contributed to Kubernetes before are probably not great candidates for working on API reviews or code organization, or like, these things are hard and they require a lot of experience with our code base before it's going to be easy for you, maybe even before it's going to be possible for you to help. So we're not, I don't think we're talking about people who've never touched Kubernetes before. So people who have interacted with the community a little bit, you know, they know that this meeting happens, they know there's a community meeting, they know there's a Slack, they've seen a few names in reviews more often than others, and they know how to find those people. I don't know who we're optimizing for that this is a big problem.
Well, we do intend to document the sub-projects, so we should do that. I think we need to move on in terms of time. You know, I just checked the README, the mailing list, and the tracking boards, and the meeting times and whatnot are also documented in the README. So I think the main thing we need to do is, and even the SIG Architecture label is in the README as well. So the main thing we need to do is to get the few bits of missing information that are there added, and to update the list of sub-projects.
Before we move on, I just want to acknowledge Jordan had his hand up, and Eric, did you get your question? Is it still relevant?
I'll just, very short, I'll just say, I mostly agree with what Aaron said. I see that there's owners files links. It's not always obvious how to get from an owner's file to a person to talk to.
Agreed.
Username is not a ticket to instant messaging someone.
No, it's not, and that's something we should fix. Jordan, before you...
I was just going to say that documenting what the subprojects, like what artifacts they're producing and where that work is happening, is good for people who want to jump in to help with the work, but it's also good for people who are depending on those artifacts and like, need to find a person to ask a question about related to that. And so I think identifying the subprojects is a good first step, and then the people who are participating in those, a good second step is for them to go gather references to artifacts and update the README to say, here's what we're doing, here's how you can help, and here's how you consume what we're doing.
I mean, the sub-projects are explicitly a list of owners files, so hopefully that's kind of done by default if you just filled it out.
Yeah, so we need to update that list.
Yeah, that's next job. Like, somebody needs to do that. And if all else, it'll be me. So
I can sign up for it to do there. I will go through the process and put myself in the position of somebody wanting to help. And I will try and find out and try and help. And
Okay.
I'll make some notes on exactly what obstacles I ran into. And if there are none, then there's no work to be done. I suspect it's more difficult than we're making it out to be.
You were on the list, the last email thread with the sub-projects. I can ping that or just send you a new copy-paste of the sub-project list, and you can start from there.
I think there's one very interesting complication with putting things in the owners file list, which is the API reviewers are scattered through a bunch of random owner files throughout the system, and it's sort of defined the other way. Like any owners file that mentions the API reviewers is owned by the API subproject, so it's going to be a huge pain to curate that manually.
I disagree, but I think we should move on.
Right.
So can I move on in the agenda, Jace?
that's what I was just going to do.
Okay.
And I was going to say, so we're on the hook to do a contributor summit presentation in KubeCon NA in Seattle. And rather than any one of us monologuing about the joys of architecture, it seemed like it would be a good idea to come to the SIG and just solicit ideas about things that we think would be topical, relevant, important, the information that we need to radiate out. Like, for example, do people even know that there's an API review process now? Stuff like that. So there's basically bullet points in here. I'd love for people to go into the agenda and just type in whatever they think would be good topics, and then we can discuss those.
The topic for initial presentation nominally was the technical direction more than the functioning of the SIG. So, you know, we have been moving in certain directions with things like using custom resource definitions for things the system depends on. It's been a year and a half since the initial architecture roadmap was sketched, and it needs some updates. So what I was thinking is we would put a stake in the ground of what we wanted the direction for 2019 to be. And so this is sort of an opportunity to start collecting if people had strong feelings about things we needed to do. I felt like this year we didn't do a super great job in making high-level progress in any particular direction. We have been incrementally making progress on certain things, but you know, for example, the previous year we made a goal of getting the workload APIs to GA, and that was really just one SIG, but you know, it was important for the whole project, and that got done. So similarly, if we want to make statements about directions we want to go, whether it's code organization and improving or improving the release quality or stability, or factoring out the resource management platform, or whatever it is, you know, I think having some high level, raising the visibility across the entire project on some small set of things, it's an opportunity to do it. It's a half-hour, slotted to be a half-hour presentation.
And I want to add one quick thing about this too. So I mean, part of what we're doing is not necessarily governance in the sense that we're going to go in and do things in people's owners files or that sort of thing. It's really that SIG Architecture acts as sort of a program management body for this technical, highly roadmap-oriented work. So our job is to facilitate the work, to help SIGs that are involved to come to consensus, to basically act as de facto leaders for the work and not necessarily the doers of the work. So that's, I think, an important distinction that we have as a role, as a guiding role in the project. And that's why this SIG was originally formed at the I guess Leadership Summit was when it was 2 years ago, where we basically said, you know, this thing is necessary because we need to guide the project. And so I just want to clarify that we are also program managers, not just people doing the work.
Yeah. So anyway, if you have ideas about that, you can dump them in here, or you can email the mailing list with ideas. When I have time to put together an initial list, I'll send it to the mailing list, and people can respond to that as well.
Next thing on the list is the slashed out approved Klog repo request. Looks like that's done.
Well, what was the resolution to that? Sorry, I didn't have time to keep up with that thread.
Basically we're forking.
Okay.
Yeah.
YAML or glog?
This is the glog. Yeah. The YAML thing was much less controversial.
The glog, the conversation I think was actually really good. Like, as much as it felt a little bit roundabout, I honestly felt it was constructive and everybody was professional and brought really good ideas. So
Do you feel that way, Dims?
Yes, I do. Definitely.
Okay.
I mean, it took a while to get there, but yes, definitely. I think it was
I don't think it took that long. Like, given the history of the project.
2 years ago we started, not 2 weeks ago.
Matt Freenet, you got your hand up.
Oh, I just had one question, and it struck me, and I haven't had a chance to go post it to the list. Are there any legal requirements we have to follow when we fork something into the Kubernetes org? Because I know bringing outside code in that's already been started elsewhere usually triggers some stuff, and I don't remember what it is, but that was the only thing that we'd probably want to dot the I's and cross the T's on.
Well, the short answer is yes. If we actually get an owner for the code organization effort, we actually need to vet dependencies and licenses and make sure we follow the right procedures, and we don't import code that has verboten licenses or no licenses and things like that. I don't know if the requirement.
So we already do that for the Kubernetes repo. and we don't do it for all the other repos.
Do
And
what?
we go through every vendor project, crawl through their Git repo until we find something that tastes like a license file, take that license file, copy it into a single place that has only about 4 approvers on it, and require that as part of pre-submit.
When I last looked at third party, it was not done correctly or consistently. And we have had, the outstanding issue from CNCF saying, hey, FOSTA scanned your code and found these problems. And we don't have an owner for fixing those.
I agree we don't have an owner. We have an existing mechanism in place that prevents obviously bad licenses from getting in, which is it has a small set of people who know what the obviously bad licenses are.
Which has failed at least a dozen times.
Pre the process.
I think, Brendan, did you have something?
I think that this is a little bit of a bike shed. I think Matt's question actually was, if we pull it into the org, do we need to somehow change the license? We've already licensed glog. I don't think we're suggesting we're going to change the license of glog. We're just changing its home. I don't think it's necessary. It's a little bit weird because it's not really going to be a CNCF project, I don't think, just because we're putting it under our GitHub repo. But putting something under our GitHub repo doesn't imply anything about licensing.
It's effectively going to be like third party, and we've forked other things from the Go libraries before. So it should be like that, I would think.
Right. So both glog and YAML both are in, we're doing exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
Great. Let's go move on to the next thing, which is conformance test PRs that need attention. So I think, is this Patrick and Brendan? Is this you that need to talk about this?
Well, so I copied the overall agenda item over from last week, where I think Aaron had started that. I own a couple of the PRs on that list, but not all of them. So did you want to start, Aaron, or should we start with the Windows one I had on the list?
Sure. So I think you had somebody who pinged me on a couple of PRs that they changed in ways that didn't seem super controversial, like it wasn't breaking behavior between OSs. But there was one PR called sets. I'm looking at the in review column of the board, and it says sets host network to false for tests which do not require it. And Brian has suggested that Tim and Boe and some people from SIG networking need to give this a really thorough look to make sure that flipping the flag away from host networking actually still causes those tests to do what is intended here. I guess I can paste the link to the PR in chat too.
If it was assigned to me, then it's in my mailbox and I just haven't seen it today.
It was not.
If it's not assigned to me, then it's lost in the ether and I won't see it.
Yeah, mostly I was asking for someone to get assigned from SIG Network.
I'm happy if you want to assign it to me, and I will either reassign it or do the work, but I won't see it if I don't get assigned.
All right, so I can be a Sherpa for these kinds of PRs. I guess that's what this board is. That's how I use it. I do actually add a lot of things and shuffle things around. So thank you, Tim St. Clair, for assigning Hawken. It's on your board now. You HA proxy it as needed, and we'll go from there.
You got it.
I think the other open thing, which there was a mailing list thread about, so maybe we don't need to discuss it too much, was whether or not we say that conformance requires a multi-node cluster. There's a daemon set test that fails on a single node cluster. We said that shouldn't be conformance because it's skipping if the cluster is a single node. They said it doesn't make any sense if the cluster is single node. And then Brian started a thread on SIG Arch asking, hey, maybe we should just say that a cluster can't be considered conformant unless it has at least 2 nodes. This would
effectively means the provider has to support multiple nodes, which I think seems totally reasonable. And I looked through the list of certified providers, and they all look like they should support multiple nodes at a glance.
Yeah, the only interesting one there was Minicube's not conformant right now. It's a question of whether you want to have Minikube be conformant.
Yeah, in the past, I had that as a goal. I think it's lower priority than making sure the vast majority of all meaningfully useful Kubernetes services, especially those that are outside the control of the open source project itself, have compatible behavior. So I say we should just make multi-node required for now and address Minikube later. Someone also made the point, well, maybe Minikube should just support multiple nodes. I think that was you.
Why not? Why, like,
So, and there are multiple
Everyone
proposals
else
for how
does
to do
this.
that. So, so that doesn't seem bad either.
Okay. Dims, you had your hand up.
Yeah. Two questions. One was about does it mean 2 worker nodes plus 1 master, or yes?
Yes.
So
basically, what I said in the list is 2 untainted nodes.
Okay. So that was one. The other one was
Have to be a master. It could be a master that's also a worker, like Minikube.
right.
As long as it's untainted, yes. Right. 2 untainted nodes.
Then the other question was, can we somehow indicate that this test failed because it's not running on multiple nodes? Just so people who are using in Minikube or local up cluster understand that there is only one test failing, and it's failing because of the multi-node requirement.
I think we should just write a test that is like 5 lines long that lists the nodes and verifies that there's at least 2 untainted nodes.
Yeah.
Well, I think that would be useful. But the other thing that we've discussed doing is actually characterizing the test and adding tags for properties which we believe may not be universally true, like requires host privilege or network privilege or cluster privilege or OS Linux specific features or Windows specific features or those kinds of things. I think that would be useful regardless for us understanding, this test failed, why might it have failed, or what kind of coverage do we have of different scenarios, how many of our tests are truly portable, things like that. So I'm really in favor of adding those categories. I don't think we can really get a good handle on what profiles make sense until we have visibility into how many tests will be affected by attributes of different profiles. Yeah, Aaron.
Jace had his hand up first.
Okay.
I just want to quickly mention that there's really 2 use cases for the conformance program. One is that we want to know what workloads are portable across different environments and ecosystems, so it's that people have a consistent user experience. The other one I don't think that really Minikube is touching on is the developer experience, that what I develop on my local area is going to run in production or whatever that looks like. So I think that we've done a good job of categorizing what the portable workload scenario is like, but I think in the future as a to-do, we should talk about what the developer experience looks like and to make sure that that's consistent as well.
So that's where I'm coming from. Dims likes to use Hack Local Up Cluster. I like to use the Kubernetes in Docker subproject that we've started at SIG testing. These are both much, much faster and let me use development builds of Kubernetes as opposed to Minikube, which is locked to release builds. But they're single node only. So one proposal I had was, what if I just drop multi-node tag in this? And then and then this begs the conformance question. Do we say that, well, it's multi-node, so this is going to be part of a multi-node profile? Because right now we have a couple hundred tests that do work against single node clusters. Or are we changing the definition of conformance to say, nope, conformance means has to be a multi-node cluster. So I'll tag this as multi-node just so I know when I'm running it on a single node that that's a test that is expected to fail for me. But it does mean that's why my local development environment is not conformant.
For now, I think we should do the latter, what you just said.
Tim,
yeah.
You basically answered the question. Is I think we can conditionalize this, right? So that the Minikube can still pass, because it's still a useful signal for folks who want to use this as a developer tool for migrate workloads.
We're saying it wouldn't pass, it would fail, but it'd be really obvious when all of the tests that fail have
why not conditionalize? You can just conditionalize the test itself, right? So
that's where we're at right now. It is conditionalized.
Yeah. So
and I think that's a mistake, right? Conditionalized tests are inherently bad.
Yeah. We're trying to say it shouldn't. We're trying to draw the hard line that conformance tests really shouldn't skip for any reason, right?
And I'm on board with Aaron's proposal too. I think having a base profile that's single node and then saying we have this one test into multi-node, that's fine. It's hard for me to figure out if it's necessary, but I think it's fine either way.
Well,
I think we are going to have to do profiles, right? And this is the latter discussion. Like, it is 100% clear to me that we're going to have to do profiles. Whether the easiest way to start the profile process is with this one test, maybe.
I agree with Brendan on that.
well, so we are going to have to do profiles. I agree with that. We need to think about the user experience of the profiles and how many profiles we're going to have. I don't want to just do one profile that affects like a really small number of tests. I think that'll be super confusing for users if we end up with lots of profiles, most of which don't matter. So
single node feels pretty general.
Right, but I mean, I think
I looked through all the certified providers, and there's not one that looks single node.
No, I think the point is there's going to be a bunch of process associated with profiles, and this one is clear. It's definitionally clear. So like, let's go do the process with one test and go do it, figure out the process, and then we can do it tomorrow. And I think we're not saying that every time there's a one-off test that fails, we should make that a profile. That's not the statement. But the statement is this is an easy way to do a profile that's very obvious.
Quentin had his hand up, and then Ken is next.
No, I just wanted to mention that, I mean, if we zoom out a little bit, the main aim of conformance tests is that I can write an application that does not step out of the conformance tests, and then I can know that it will run on any conformant cluster. But if the conformance tests are not broad enough, then I can't possibly write a useful application that runs within them. It always has to use stuff outside of conformance. And on the flip side, if the conformance is too broad, then we limit what a conformant application, a conformant deployment is. So yeah, we can't just try and minimize the number of profiles, because if at the end of the day the single profile we have is not useful because you can't develop an application within it, then we failed.
My only thought was, I think everyone agrees that profiles are going to happen at some point. I think Brian has a very good point that if we're going to do it, we should do it for something that's worthwhile. So is it really worth our effort or someone's effort to go in and figure out how to do profiles to support the single node use case for one test? Because that really where we want to spend our efforts.
What about Docker's Kubernetes support? It's pretty good. There's a lot of dang Docker users in a single node, but it's really pretty good other than that.
Is it really a problem to report the result as conformant except for it fails the multi-node test?
Well, I don't think we want conformant to accept, right? Like I think that's a worse precedent than starting a profile.
No, I think if you're just using it for development, it's fine. You look at that and you're like, okay, this is a good signal, except that if I want to run on multiple nodes, it doesn't work for that.
Sure. I mean, I think it's fine to say that, like, we're going to say it's not conformant, but it's the scope of its non-conformance is well understood. Yeah. I that's different than saying conformant except, I guess, at some level. To the other point, I think that there's two aspects to building any program like profiles. One is the process, and that's just straight bureaucracy. And the other is the definition of the profiles. I think they're actually both going to be semi-thorny, and I think that we will make better progress. The reason I suggest it might be better to do it here is that we'll make good progress on the process without having to really have a big thorny fight about what is in the profiles or not, because it's just obvious, right?
The reason I don't want to use this is because it will just add a profile to every single existing certified provider that users will then be confronted with. They'll be confronted with the certified badge plus the multi-node profile for every single provider, like all 70 of them.
What do we call it? It's an unbadgeable layer. It's a profile, but it's not a badge earning profile.
I would say there are enough things that we know we're going to need profiles for that are way more worthwhile that I think we should focus on those.
Yeah. And so in that note, I'd really like to kick this discussion away from multi-node. Like, I'm fine just taking the ding on that. And let's move it into the reason Patrick and Brendan have showed up here to talk about like Windows specific stuff, unless anybody had anything really pressing on that last point.
I come for the beard mostly.
Oh, okay. Well,
I don't think I can match that for November. So. Yeah. Okay, so if we're going to move forward on that, so basically, when it comes to the Windows stuff, 2 weeks ago we talked about, the preferred approach that we wanted to do was to have a cluster built that contained both Windows and Linux nodes, because in that mode, we could go ahead and all the conformance tests could still run, and they would run on, on the appropriate nodes. And so that was the first option that we have a work in progress PR on that's linked there. And what that does is basically add an additional flag that will add node selectors to the tests appropriately. This is something that is it's a relatively simple solution from an implementation standpoint, but it does have a little bit more maintenance compared with having a full-featured solution like a conformance profile. And so I think that for version 13, the one PR that I have linked for option 1 is something that would be pretty achievable, because we've already identified most of the test cases and we've got a list that's there. And so we would basically just do a couple code review passes on that. And that could work as a point-in-time solution to test that hybrid cluster where the tests that are appropriate for Windows run on Windows and the remainder run on Linux. And in doing that, we'll also have a clear list of what tests could go into an OS-specific profile later, as we continue that discussion, if that's the direction that we want to go for version 14, or I don't know what the target would be. So I guess let's go to we had some questions. I saw Tim, but who was first?
Tim.
So I had a question with regards to what it means to be conformance on a Windows that's not a profile in a mixed cluster, because it's clear to me that some features will work in A and not B, right? So unless it's been a profile, this is a good example of actually where I think profiles matters a lot more, because the characteristics of features will not be the same across platforms, right? It just won't. You can't enable certain workloads with feature XYZ on this environment from A to B, right? So I don't know what it would mean to be conformance in a mixed environment. I can see what it means to have a Windows profile and to have a star NIX profile, but I don't know what it would mean to be a mixed.
So I think what we're trying to achieve here is sort of, oh, sorry, I'd say their hands. I can answer, but I can also go to hands. What's the preference?
Yeah, I have a few things I just wanted to say about this. So first of all, I want to thank Brendan for dumping test categorization into the bottom of the conformance profile v2 doc. I pasted a link into the chat. I think there are a few different issues that are getting muddled together. One is there are tests that work in theory on both Windows and Linux, but I assume they still have to have different images.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, but
So
that work is already done, right? And merged, right?
Okay. That's already this list to be merged.
Okay, there are PRs. The work is done. I guess it's not merged, and it's necessary. Also, for example, a Chinese conformant person can't actually pass conformance right now because you can't pull Google images.
Right.
So, there's work that's needed for around parameterizing images in general.
Yeah, and that's
I'm actually actively working on that right now.
Okay, cool. And then we need to categorize things that are specifically dependent on Linux behaviors, like they're just Linux pass-through, like AppArmor or something like that in the API. And it looks like there is the start of a list of Linux-specific tests. I haven't had time to look through the whole thing yet, but I intend to. And presumably there might be tests that get added that have some Windows dependencies. And then there's the question of the way we run conformance for the tests that are, sort of OS independent. In theory, what do we do? So we're going to have other tests that's already started coming up that have specific requirements of the host systems, whether it's GPUs or whatnot. So I think we're going to want to think about maybe not the whole cluster as a adhering to a specific profile, but what do we do about tests with specific requirements on specific types of nodes? And I don't know the answer to that yet, but that might be a factor. Like maybe we don't need a Windows profile. Just that, if there are Windows nodes, the Windows tests run. So I think that's something that needs a little bit more thought in the context of other likely things that will come up, like GPUs just being a popular example these days.
Yes. So are there any other hands? I don't see any other hands. I can sort of describe the approach that we're trying to take here. One is trying to be very pragmatic towards getting Windows support to GA and 1.13. And obviously we want to be able to have conformant clusters. Like the most sort of cheater way to do this would actually just be to say, hey, it's a hybrid cluster, it's conformant, let's add Linux specific node selectors to every test and we'll pass. And we won't even test the Windows side of the house. Like that feels like cheating, right? And so the hybrid approach that we're taking is to actually say, hey, you know what? We're going to try our best to run as many of the tests as possible that we think are reasonable on the Windows side of the house. And the rest of them, we don't want to water down conformance. So the rest of them will run on the Linux side of the house. The alternative is to actually bite the bullet and do profiles. My belief is that may very well turn into a giant bike shed, and thus we'll miss the 1.13 deadline. And so in some ways it's to say, hey, let's have something we can say usefully about conformance in a Windows environment for 1.13 with an acknowledgement that we believe that ultimately profiles is the right way to do this or maybe it's like what you're saying, like some sort of form of node selector that's not really a profile exactly, but like each test defines the node selectors it should use or something like that in the 1.14 time range. So that's sort of the philosophy that's there right now.
Yeah, and there could be something we add either to the scheduler explicitly or to admission control that would automatically identify the kinds of nodes things have to run on.
It's really hard actually having done this. So we actually implemented this for Azure Container Instances. It's really hard because if it's a known base layer, then maybe, but there's nothing in the Docker image spec that says anything about what the layer is. So you have to like go and do heuristics.
Timothy had his hand up.
So it sounds great. Like in general, in managing multiple SIGs over time, this is the typical pattern that we use. We basically say like we'll do X for a period of time Y, and we'll eventually go to fix it later on with this grand vision of the future. And what happens is that grand vision of the future never actually comes to fruition. So we can let this pass, but then where do we stop? Where do we actually pay down the technical debt around profiles to make sure that we're actually doing the level best for the community?
Well, I promise to drive profiles forward in parallel, right? Like I'm happy to do those PRs and start now, right? Not sort of start in an aspirational future, but start now. I just don't have confidence that it will finish before the 1.13 release.
So looking through the list of tests, and not being super familiar with Windows, there are things that are obviously Linuxisms like Linux capabilities or seccomp or AppArmor and SE Linux and those kinds of things. I'm seeing some tests in this list that are not as obvious. Do you have a doc somewhere that explains like whether these things are, well, just not implemented yet, or these don't even make sense for Windows, and here's why?
I don't have an existing doc yet. I'd rather not have another doc, so do you want to just collect some of that in there?
Do we have a sense, though, for like the general?
That'd be fine. Like atomic subwriter volumes should support subpaths within projected pod. Sounds like a test that's not in the not implemented yet category, as opposed to something that I would expect to never work. Right? Like can multiple containers in a pod share volumes in a normal way, or is that ever going to work on Windows?
Yeah, and that works today, but what Windows cannot do is project individual files into an existing mount.
Right, so the way that the test is written, it's a single file that's shared as opposed to a directory that's shared, is that right?
I'm not sure, I don't have the test code in front of me on that specific one, but there were a handful of tests, maybe I want to say like 3 or 4, that depended on the particular behavior of projecting one file and one file only over one that was in the base image.
Yeah, so we're going to need that list for users anyway. Like if you're running on Windows, you should expect these things to not work and why. And we're probably going to need some kind of linters or validators. So it really helped me for reviewing whether this test list makes sense to write that kind of justification, and then we can get it turned into user docs.
Yeah, I'm working on the user docs starting this week. I've been focusing on carrying forward all the stuff that needs code review at the top priority, and docs are going to be the next couple of weeks.
But again, I think, and I see Tim's hand, so I'm going to respect that. But I just want to say, I think these are the reasons why it's going to, if we go down this road, it's going to take longer than 1.13, and why I would prefer to have this sort of parallel approach where we go conformant, sort of best effort conformance for 1.13 without changing the conformance suite, and then do the due diligence on all of the tests in a slower pass and with profiles.
Okay, I'm somewhat sympathetic to that because it's going to be as conformant as any Windows system.
Right.
Right. So it's not like they're going to be a bunch of differently compatible Windows implementations. But I want to read through the whole list of tests first so I can get a better sense of what's not going to work.
I just want to echo that because every one of those, like this one example is a great example because it was added for real users for real reasons. And I certainly don't think we're in a position to say, well, Windows doesn't implement this feature, so therefore it can never ever be compliant. But I think we need to be crystal clear about users. If you're using Windows, this subset of things that work on Kubernetes Linux don't work either yet or will never work.
Yeah, if you're trying to make something that's general that injects credentials, let's say, then it better not depend on this specific feature.
Yeah, although actually along those lines, I just found out that if you're injecting credentials for Redis for the Sentinel, it doesn't work on Linux either because Redis expects to be able to read-write that file, and now that file is read-only, right? So like weird shit happens all over the place, I guess, is maybe the TLDR out of the edges.
We're at time. Patrick, any last second thing you want to add here?
Yeah, well, as one I want to call around single file mapping is this is not different between Kubernetes and Docker Swarm and the developer scenario. That doesn't work on Windows across the board. So applying the principle of least surprise here, a Windows user would never expect that to work because they moved to Kubernetes from another orchestrator. So.
Well, it's an interesting question. Are Windows Kubernetes users who are adopting Kubernetes or Kubernetes users who are adopting Windows?
I think they're generally, in my experience, Windows users who are adopting Kubernetes.
I would guess that's probably true. So if you could, can you start a thread on the Kubernetes SIG Architecture mailing list so we can start hammering this out there?
Okay. So
and link to all relevant issues, PRs, and this list of tests.
I want to thank everybody for a great meeting. This has been fantastic. Have a great week, and we'll see you in 7 days.
Yep. Thanks a lot.